Also beginning in the time period of Augustine is just war theory. And this will become an important aspect of Christian theology throughout the next several centuries. When is it righteous to go to war? What acts are righteous in war? Right. Now, of course, prior to this, when there's not these large numbers of Christians in the military, you don't have this great, theory about war, theology about war. Most of the writing is Christians shouldn't be involved in the military. But now that you have a Christian empire, there are Christians in the military. What does it mean to be a Christian in the military? So Augustine says, well, there are certain reasons righteous reasons that you go to war. Jus ad bellum is the Latin phrase. Justice towards war. War is not going away. We have to face it sometimes. Christians want peace, but sometimes war has to take place. So if the intent is just, that's a good reason. If the objective is just, that's a good reason to go to war. But there are also important actions in war, jus ad bello. When you're engaged in military, when you're engaged in a war, how do you act? Right, so there are these codes of war that develop about what kind of actions are appropriate, who can appropriately call a just war, all of that reflecting this interaction between church and state that's developing in this post-Constantinian period. This interaction between church and state and attempting to really think about the relationship between the two of those continues obviously into the Middle Ages as this relationship continues to grow. As you have this Christian government, as you have the church continuing to have a more expansive role in Europe, particularly here we're focusing on Western Christianity. There are a lot of things that take place in Eastern Christianity where there is a very close tie between the emperor and the Eastern Orthodox churches. But we're focusing predominantly on Western Christian history because of the influence it has on our contemporary situation, particularly here in the United States. One aspect that becomes very important in the Middle Ages is the rise of the power of the Pope. Now, through the 3rd century, 4th century, the Bishop of Rome has become more and more important. And throughout this period, the bishops of Rome at various times have claimed more and more authority for their position. And so there is, in the West, a gradual consolidation of religious power in this office, the Pope, also termed the papacy, right? The papacy referring to the office of the Pope. Now, there are a couple of things that are important in how this develops. How does it get where the Bishop of Rome is able to claim universal leadership of the earthly church? Well, you have the role of Peter in the New Testament. And Peter, of course, is prominent among the apostles and, a leader among the apostles. He certainly doesn't have the authority like the popes of the Middle Ages would have, but he does have some leadership role in the church in those early years. Of course, he is also tied in his later life to the church at Rome. In his letters, there's a reference in 1 Peter chapter 5 to apparently the church at Rome. A lot of tradition connecting Peter to Rome, and so here's this very prominent apostle connected with the church at Rome. He identifies himself as an elder, so a leader in the church, So with the idea of apostolic succession, right, a church tied to Peter would, we could understand, gradually become very, very significant. In addition, there are a lot of ties to Paul as well. So not only do you have one apostle tied to the Church of Rome, you also have two apostles. You have two apostles tied to the church at Rome. And so Rome gradually has this greater and greater influence as a variety of controversies develop, like what do you do about people who have lapsed in the persecution of Decius? People turn to the church at Rome and the bishop at Rome for guidance, for what to do, make a decision about this. And so there is this concern to have unity with the church at Rome. And then, of course, as Constantine becomes emperor, he grants more and more power to churches and bishops, particularly the Bishop of Rome. There's a role that the Bishop of Rome begins to have. And ultimately, there are these claims made that Peter is the successor of Christ, the representative of Christ on earth. The Bishop of Rome is Peter's direct successor. So, there's this influence that the papacy has. Now, the Eastern Church denies those claims. They have this model of the patriarchs, which would include the Bishop of Rome, share authority. But there is this development in the West. Eventually, the papacy is fully formed by the late 6th, early 7th century. Gregory I appears to be the first Bishop of Rome to truly be a pope, like what we think of when we think of popes. But there will be further development, and popes will continue to exert power. So that power is not just religious power, but it becomes political power as well, as there is this relationship between the emperor and the pope, and then religious officials taking on sometimes secular authority or secular roles. When it comes to the relationship between church and state, in the West, the major thinking about this was known as the two kingdom models. There were two spheres or two kingdoms, the church and the state. Now, for Roman Catholicism, there is the desire to keep the emperor out of the church. The emperor, who by this point has moved to Constantinople, and then a variety of things happen in the West, and the barbarians take over, and so the Germanic tribes, and so there are these emperors in the West now, and so a lot of the popes are connected to those emperors. They want to keep these emperors out of the church, but not necessarily the other way around. Right? So there's this desire to have influence of the church on the state, but not have the state influencing the church. So the religious sphere, the religious kingdom, is higher, is more important than the worldly kingdom, the state. Now, emperors, of course, have religious duties, suppression of heresy, for example, but they are subservient to the church in this model. And so there is this idea that the Pope should be the leader of both the church as well as influential on the emperor. Well, the emperors, the rulers in the West. Some emperors, some kings, right? There's a lot of things going on in the West we don't have time to go over. Often ignored a lot of those things. The Pope often found himself having to obey imperial decrees. But essentially this model is, the church and the world are two different kingdoms, but the churchly sphere is over the worldly sphere or the state. Now, because of this, of course, these claims that the papacy is making, that the Pope is making, often popes and emperors found themselves in conflict over a variety of issues, like who has the right to ordain a bishop to a specific church. Well, the Pope felt that should be his authority. The emperor felt that should be his authority. Who makes the decision of the new Pope? Right? When the Pope dies, who decides who the new Pope is? Is it something the emperor should decide, or is it something that the religious officials of the church should decide? So there's this back and forth tension at a variety of times. Attempting to exert your authority over each other. And so throughout the Middle Ages, you have a lot of conflicts over who makes decisions. And of course, as an emperor develops in the West, the Pope tries to claim that it is the Pope's job to decide who the rightful emperor should be. So a lot of conflict here, but it does demonstrate that the papacy, the church, has some religious or political influence. And we can see that in two developments toward the end of the Middle Ages. The first one is the Crusades. Now, the Crusades are a military endeavor. Right? It develops as Islam is spreading in the Middle East, and particularly beginning to push into lands controlled by the Eastern Emperor. And so the Eastern Emperor, Orthodox Christian, wants help from the West to try and push the Muslims back. And so he appeals to the Pope for help. And so the Pope calls a crusade to try and push the Muslims back, as well as go into Jerusalem, the Holy Land, free that from Muslim control. So turning to the Pope for what is essentially a political military endeavor, which the Pope does call a crusade. It makes a variety of religious promises, both for this life and claims about what will take place in the afterlife if you participate in this crusade. So the papacy very involved, and churches very involved in making the Crusades not just a military event, but a religious event as well. Right? So this kind of intermingling of politics and religion. Another example of this was the Inquisition. Essentially, the Inquisition was originally concerned about the spread of heresy. And prior to the 1100s, 1200s, local bishops were responsible for finding heresy and suppressing it. But eventually the Inquisition was set up as an ecclesiastical court, a churchly court, that was going to investigate and suppress heresy. And a lot of the justification for the Inquisition came from the writings of Augustine on the use of coercion with heretics. But by the 1200s, while Augustine's thinking fines, imprisonment, loss of property, the Inquisition is adding torture and execution. Now, Augustine thought that this coercive activity was meant to be, you punish the body to save the soul. You use physical punishments to bring about religious salvation, spiritual salvation. But, and that's still kind of the model within the Inquisition, but the inquisitors are willing to use death in certain circumstances. Right? There are a lot of rules about what can and cannot be done, but they're willing to use execution as an appropriate punishment for heretics so that others would be warned. Right? So it's still going to be still the goal of the execution is the salvation of others, warning them, don't follow this heresy. Okay, again, it doesn't make it right. I'm not trying to justify it. But, what we're seeing here is this transition of, we're incorporating more methods where you're essentially using the coercive power of or you're using coercive political power, right? It's done through the church, but you're using tools that are stately tools. They're not church tools, right? Church tools are preaching, are encouragement, or persuasion. Persuasion, you're using, the Inquisition's using punishment, is using imprisonment, is using torture, even death. And of course, the Inquisition broadens beyond heresy, turns to Jews and Muslims, especially in Spain, where Jews and Muslims were expected to convert or be kicked out of Spain, and so it becomes particularly violent in Spain as well.